Chapter 5 of The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elaine Tweddle. The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 5 The Net. We raised the poor victim and turned him over on his back. I dropped upon my knees, and with unsteady fingers began to strike a match. A slight breeze was arising and sighing gently through the elms, but screened by my hands the flame of the match took life. It illuminated wanly the sun-baked face of Nayland Smith, his eyes gleaming with unnatural brightness. I bent forward, and the dying light of the match touched that other face. "Oh God!" whispered Smith. A faint puff of wind extinguished the match. In all my surgical experience I had never met with anything quite so horrible. Forsyth's livid face was streaked with tiny streams of blood, which proceeded from a series of irregular wounds. One group of these clustered upon his left temple, another beneath his right eye, and others extended from the chin down to the throat. They were black, almost like tattoo marks, and the entire injured surface was bloated indescribably. His fists were clenched. He was quite rigid. Smith's piercing eyes were set upon me eloquently as I knelt on the path and made my examination, an examination which that first glimpse when Forsyth came staggering out from the trees had rendered useless, a mere matter of form. "He's quite dead, Smith," I said huskily. "It's unnatural. It..." Smith began beating his fist into his left palm and taking little short nervous strides up and down beside the dead man. I could hear a car humming along the highroad, but I remained there on my knees, staring dully at the disfigured, bloody face, which but a matter of minutes since had been that of a clean-looking British seaman. I found myself contrasting his neat, squarely trimmed moustache with the bloated face above it, and counting the little drops of blood which trembled upon its edge. There were footsteps approaching. I stood up. The footsteps quickened, and I turned as a constable ran up. "What's this?" he demanded gruffly, and stood with his fists clenched, looking from Smith to me and down at that which lay between us. Then his hand flew to his breast. There was a silvern gleam, and... "Drop that whistle!" snapped Smith, and struck it from the man's hand. "Where's your lantern? Don't ask questions." The constable stared back, and was evidently debating upon his chances with the two of us, when my friend pulled a letter from his pocket and thrust it under the man's nose. "Read that!" he directed harshly, "and then listen to my orders." There was something in his voice which changed the officer's opinion of the situation. He directed the light of his lantern upon the open letter, and seemed to be stricken with wonder. "If you have any doubts," continued Smith, "you may not be familiar with the Commissioner's signature. You have only to ring up Scotland Yard from Dr. Petrie's house, to which we shall now return, to disperse them." He pointed to Forsyth. "Help us to carry him there. We must not be seen. This must be hushed up. You understand? It must not get into the press." The man saluted respectfully, and the three of us addressed ourselves to the mournful task. By slow stages we bore the dead man to the edge of the common, carried him across the road and into my house, without exciting attention even on the part of those vagrants who nightly slept out in the neighborhood. We laid our burden upon the surgery table. "You will want to make an examination, Petrie," said Smith, in his decisive way, "and the officer here might 'phone for an ambulance. I've some investigations to make also. I must have the pocket lamp." He raced upstairs to his room, and an instant later came running down again. The front door banged. "The telephone is in the hall," I said to the constable. "Thank you, sir." He went out of the surgery as I switched on the lamp over the table, and began to examine the marks upon Forsyth's skin. These, as I have said, were in groups, and nearly all in the form of elongated punctures, a fairly deep incision with a pear-shaped and superficial scratch beneath it. One of the tiny wounds had penetrated the right eye. The symptoms, or those which I had been enabled to observe as Forsyth had first staggered into view from among the elms, were most puzzling. Clearly enough, the muscles of articulation and the respiratory muscles had been affected, and now the livid face, dotted over with tiny wounds (they were also on the throat), sent me mentally groping for a clue to the manner of his death. No clue presented itself, and my detailed examination of the body availed me nothing. The grey herald of dawn was come when the police arrived with the ambulance and took Forsyth away. I was just taking my cap from the rack when Nayland Smith returned. "Smith," I cried, "have you found anything?" He stood there in the grey light of the hallway, tugging at the lobe of his left ear, an old trick of his. The bronzed face looked very gaunt, I thought, and his eyes were bright with that febrile glitter which once I had disliked, but which I had learned from experience were due to tremendous nervous excitement. At such times he could act with icy coolness, and his mental faculties seemed temporarily to acquire an abnormal keenness. He made no direct reply, but "Have you any milk?" he jerked abruptly. So wholly unexpected was the question that for a moment I failed to grasp it. Then "Milk?" I began. "Exactly, Petrie. If you can find me some milk, I shall be obliged." I turned to descend to the kitchen, when "The remains of the turbot from dinner, Petrie, would also be welcome, and I think I should like a trowel." I stopped at the stair-head and faced him. "I cannot suppose that you are joking, Smith," I said, "but..." He laughed dryly. "Forgive me, old man," he replied. "I was so preoccupied with my own train of thought that it never occurred to me how absurd my request must have sounded. I will explain my singular taste later. At the moment, hustle is the watchword." Evidently he was in earnest, and I ran downstairs accordingly, returning with a garden trowel, a plate of cold fish, and a glass of milk. "Thanks, Petrie," said Smith. "If you would put the milk in a jug..." I was past wondering, so I simply went and fetched a jug, into which he poured the milk. Then, with the trowel in his pocket, the plate of cold turbot in one hand and the milk jug in the other, he made for the door. He had it open when another idea evidently occurred to him. "I'll trouble you for the pistol, Petrie." I handed him the pistol without a word. "Don't assume that I want to mystify you," he added, "but the presence of anyone else might jeopardize my plan. I don't expect to be long." The cold light of dawn flooded the hallway momentarily, then the door closed again and I went upstairs to my study, watching Nayland Smith as he strode across the common in the early morning mist. He was making for the 9 Elms, but I lost sight of him before he reached them. I sat there for some time, watching for the first glow of sunrise. A policeman tramped past the house, and a while later a belated reveler in evening clothes. That sense of unreality assailed me again. Out there in the gray mists a man who was vested with powers which rendered him a law unto himself, who had the British government behind him in all that he might choose to do, who had been summoned from Rangoon to London on singular and dangerous business, was employing himself with a plate of cold turbot, a jug of milk, and a trowel! Away to the right, just barely visible, a tramcar stopped by the common, then proceeded on its way, coming in a westerly direction. Its lights twinkled yellowly through the grayness, but I was less concerned with the approaching car than with the solitary traveler who had descended from it. As the car went rocking by below me, I strained my eyes in an endeavor more clearly to discern the figure which, leaving the highroad, had struck out across the common. It was that of a woman, who seemingly carried a bulky bag or parcel. One must be a gross materialist to doubt that there are latent powers in man which man, in modern time, neglects, or knows not how to develop. I became suddenly conscious of a burning curiosity respecting this lonely traveler, who traveled at an hour so strange. With no definite plan in mind, I went downstairs, took a cap from the rack, and walked briskly out of the house and across the common in a direction which I thought would enable me to head off the woman. I had slightly miscalculated the distance, as fate would have it, and with a patch of gorse effectually screening my approach, I came upon her, kneeling on the damp grass and unfastening the bundle which had attracted my attention. I stopped and watched her. She was dressed in bedraggled fashion in rusty black, wore a common black straw hat and a thick veil, but it seemed to me that the dexterous hands at work untying the bundle were slim and white, and I perceived a pair of hideous cotton gloves lying on the turf beside her. As she threw open the wrappings and lifted out something that looked like a small shrimping net, I stepped around the bush, crossed silently the intervening patch of grass, and stood beside her. A faint breath of perfume reached me, of a perfume which, like the secret incense of ancient Egypt, seemed to assail my soul. The glamour of the Orient was in that subtle essence, and I only knew one woman who used it. I bent over the kneeling figure. "Good morning," I said. "Can I assist you in any way?" She came to her feet like a startled deer, and flung away from me with the lithe movement of some Eastern dancing girl.